Very much. Okay. So I'll start now. My talk today is demonstrating how Shrek tackles social and cultural issues in a positive way. So although the narrative is often to challenge or point digs at Disney, I suggest that many of these subversions, when read through a disability lens, helps to create a positive narrative about identity and self-acceptance. So to begin, I'd just like to give a short introduction to disability studies, which is my background for my PhD. So the specific frameworks that can be used to highlight narratives that conform to or subvert disabling stereotypes. So the basic premise of disability studies is based on two models, the medical model and the social model. The medical model views disability as an individual problem that is in need of a cure, whereas the social model describes disability as a social construct, highlighting how barriers in society, such as inaccessible buildings and negative attitudes, disable people with impairments. The affirmation model then builds upon the social model, but neglects the negativity associated with impairment and instead focuses on positive self-identity and disability pride. So we can use these models as frameworks when analysing films to look at how characters who do not fit the norms of their society are expected to be cured or excluded from society or are able to embrace their own identity. Critical disability studies takes this a step further. Based upon the foundations of the social model, it centres around disability and challenges the ableist assumptions in society, going beyond the simple binary of impairment and disability to more complex representations. As Alice Hall states, in critical disability studies, we can explore how examples where the text does not explicitly name a particular impairment or condition, but where disability structures the logic of the narrative or ways of seeing and knowing in the text. Another theory in critical disability studies that is useful for analysing narratives in films is the concept of normalcy, by Leonard J. Davis. He emphasises how the able body is dominant in our society and culture and challenges the hegemony of normalcy to highlight how the disabled body is deviant, othered, and stereotyped in culture, as it does not conform to the expected norms of the able body. He also emphasises that when a text does not claim to be about disability, it can still be read through the concept of normalcy, because where bodily difference is highlighted, the expected normalcy is disrupted. Also developed from disability studies is the monstrous figure. When disfigurement or physical difference is presented in a film, it is typically represented as a monster, and therefore negative in that disability is being used as a sign of monster, evil, ugly, or a freak. Shrek, however, subverts this stereotype as he is an ogre, a typical monstrous figure, but he is not represented as evil, scary monster in the end, in the end, he finds true love and doesn't die, unlike many monsters in other films. So just to point out, this isn't to say that Shrek is physically impaired or disabled, but that his society disables him because of his appearance. He is a strong and very capable ogre that is stereotyped and othered in this particular way by his community because of his appearance. But ultimately, he overcomes this, and as such, the movie continues to dispel many of the traditional stereotypes of disability. So in Shrek, he is feared by his community and misunderstood. We see that through the social model, Shrek's treatment is negative, impacting him as he hides away in a swamp because of his physical difference. As his journey progresses, we see how his society views him as monstrous, treating him negatively because his appearance does not conform to the expectations of normalcy in his society. Shrek makes friends with Donkey, another character that does not fit the normal physical appearance, sharing their experience together. They rescue Fiona, but their journey back is long, which allows Shrek and Donkey, as well as the audience, to learn more about Fiona. She is an unconventional princess in that she isn't scared of Shrek, fights and kills animals. Another dig at Disney for their stereotypical princesses. As the relationship between Shrek and Fiona grows, Shrek believes that no one can see him for anything but an ogre. As Donkey questions him, he asks, "What's your problem, Shrek? What have you got wrong with the world?" Shrek replies saying, "Look, I'm not the one with the problem, okay? It's the world that seems to have a problem with me. People take one look at me and go, ah, help, run, a big, stupid, ugly ogre." This quote highlights how Shrek is aware of the way that other people view and treat him. He is blaming his society and showing how it's their problem for judging him only on appearance. At this point, Fiona is looking on in secret because she turns into an ogre at night. When they are back at the swamp, after Fiona is taken by Lord Farquaad, Donkey persuades Shrek to go back and rescue Fiona, as he knows how she truly felt and that she is actually an ogre. As Shrek interrupts the wedding, the sun is setting and Fiona reveals that she is an ogre too. The audience gasp, and Lord Farquaad shrieks, "It's disgusting," and orders them away. It is then when Donkey and Dragon fly in and Dragon eats Lord Farquaad. This whole scene shows many subversions of the typical functions given in fairy tales, and some of the crowd even cheer, indicating their relief after conforming to the normative society controlled by Lord Farquaad. Shrek confesses his love for Fiona, and their kiss breaks her spell, but rather than turn back into a human princess, she stays as an ogre. After they return to the swamp, overrun by fairy tale creatures, we see how his community now accepts him. But better still, Shrek is confident and happy being an ogre and has been able to find true love and friends. This shows that although he is portrayed as a monstrous figure in the beginning, he subverts the traditional stereotype and is accepted by his community. Shrek, Fiona, and Donkey are accepted, respected, and able to live their lives without fear or exclusion. This is a positive alternative to most representations of unusual and different bodies. So at first we saw that Shrek's society disabled him because of his physical appearance, which impacted his self-confidence. But as the affirmation model of disability is highlighted, Shrek is now able to live a non-tragic life, embracing a positive self-identity that is embraced and celebrated by others. This is a quote from an article that just came out last month called "Subverting the Monster, Reading Shrek as a Disability Fairy Tale," which was great to read, as it was very similar to my proposal that I submit for this talk. The article reads Shrek as through a disability lens, looking at the monstrous figure and through the affirmation model. And the authors Jordan Ellis and Kate Ellis conclude by saying, although the first Shrek movie is about overcoming, it's not about overcoming their monstrosity or disability. Instead, the film was about overcoming societal and internalized views that disable them and embracing a community that takes pride in their difference. My PhD research is looking at disability representation in Disney animation. So I just wanted to briefly compare Shrek to an example from the Disney canon. Beauty and the Beast came out 10 years before Shrek in 1999. A prince is turned into a beast and locked in a castle. When Belle tries to save her father from the castle, she has to become a prisoner to release him. Belle befriends the castle servants, and as time passes, herself and the beast fall in love with one another. At this point of the film, we have a stereotypical Disney princess who falls for a beast. The beast can be viewed through a critical disability studies lens, in that he is being punished, and the punishment is to become ugly and a monster. He is then othered, isolated, and excluded. When Gaston injures the beast, he dies in Belle's arms, and she professes her true love for the beast, undoing the spell, which is just as we see in the church with Shrek and Fiona. However, in Beauty and the beast turns back into the human prince, who is handsome, able-bodied, and normal, even though Belle fell in love with the beast. Through this, the film emphasizes that the transformation of the beast is needed, hinting that deformities and differences are unnatural and need to be fixed and overcome. This relates to the medical model of disability, in which narratives use magical cures to fix a character's abnormality, implying that a deviation from the norm must be fixed to be accepted in society. So as Shrek contains many jokes and subversions towards traditional fairy tales and stereotypes, particularly in Disney animated films, we can see how the subversions they took to create a narrative of finding love despite physical appearance is a clever spin on the traditional normative narratives we see elsewhere, particularly prior to the 2000s. And a critical disability studies reading of Shrek helps to emphasize this. And that's all from me, thank you.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Jess. That was really interesting. So our next paper is given by Chris Holliday. Chris, are you able to share your screen at this point?
Yeah, I'll do that now.
And I'll just quickly introduce you. So Chris teaches film studies and liberal arts at King's College London. He specialises in Hollywood cinema, animation history, and contemporary digital media. He's published several book chapters and articles on digital technology and computer animation. He's the author of the computer animated film and co-editor of the collections Fantasy Animation and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, New Perspective on Production, Reception, Legacy. And his work can also be found on the Fantasy Animation website, blog, and podcast as well. So thanks very much, Chris, and over to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the title, as you can see, the title of this paper comes from a brief one-liner. So a brief one-liner spoken in the first Shrek, in which the donkey, voiced by Eddie Murphy, of course, is tasked by Princess Fiona with hunting down a blue flower with red thorns, which he hopes will provide a soothing medicinal antidote to the arrow that's penetrating Shrek's body following the trio's violent encounter with Robin Hood and his merry men. So wandering through the forest, and I've put the picture there, in a state of increasing anxiety, and he even says later that he will need a, quote, whole lot of therapy on account of a twitching eye, the donkey looks frantically in all directions for the flower, seemingly unable to see what is in front of him. Only then does he declare to the audience that, man, this would be so much easier if I wasn't colorblind. So this throwaway comedic line, I think, offers a potential way in to discuss the politics of race within the Shrek films, in that it marks the meeting point of performance, vocal performance by Murphy, and questions of color, in this case, in its absence. More than this, I was struck by the possibilities of situating the four Shrek films, as well as various shorts released between 2009 and 2010 within two contexts related to the cultural blindness of color. So the first is the normalization of a post-racial imaginary or post-racial refrain, largely across the US in the lead up to Obama's election in 2009, as obviously the first person of color to hold presidential office. And secondly, more recent questions of colorblindness and ultimately colorblind or aversive racism, which operate according to a failure to see institutional or systemic structures of privilege and discrimination, all the while being framed as a positive step away from racism. And has been widely discussed, colorblindness, and this is what I'm interested in, functions to reproduce racial inequality, as by refusing to talk about or see race, this actually allows society to ignore or sideline examples of persistent discrimination. So I'm really interested in the oil and water relationship between the Shrek films and this sort of historical context, whereby the Shrek film's representational tactics and anthropomorphic register in their portrayal of the donkey in particular comes into conflict with this sort of post-racial or supposedly colorblind moment of production. I also want to look at the series' relationship to what has been termed racialized anthropomorphism, and then what this might mean for animation's own aversive potential. So the evolution of a post-racial imaginary that enveloped media and culture following Obama's inauguration in 2009 is certainly, I think, important for understanding both the context of the Shrek franchise and its signifying practices. And also, but also, how in 7 or 8 years, America went from a post 9/11 culture of fear in relation to the other to a wave of post-racial politics that would be achieved thanks to supposed transcendence and colorblind universalism. That is, thanks to Obama, the country had supposedly arrived at a theoretical and material space that had overcome racism and racial prejudice, grounded in the ability to sort of dismiss racial practices and attitudes as something relegated to the past. So when Obama delivered his keynote address to the assembled delegates of the Democratic National Convention on July the 27th, 2004. So 3 weeks after the release of Shrek 2, and also the same day as my 19th birthday, he asserted that there is not a Black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America, there's the United States of America. So as Obama's speech makes clear, America's post-racial imaginary was supported by this discourse of colorblindness, one representing or signaling perhaps a cultural and political quest to harmonize post-racial relations in America at the time. And with Obama era, or within Obama era America, the country had apparent claims to being post-partisan, post-racial, an environment free from racial preference. And understanding Obama's relationship to the post-racial moment and potentially links to the Shrek films has of course been sharpened, I think, within the last few years, obviously during Trump's tenure, discourses around white fragility, Black Lives Matter, and so forth. So a recent article from earlier this year by Ibrahim X. Kendi remembers the evening of Obama's inauguration as follows. And I won't read the quote out, but just a couple of things. If he could win Iowa, he could win America. And then at the bottom, as Obama won more primaries, the narrative spread. The fact that racial inequity existed and persisted didn't matter. And another scholar, L.S. Cashmore, argued that in this way, Obama functioned as a celebrity, an important celebrity signpost, selling the idea that America was no longer monocle to a history pockmarked by racism, segregation, and victimization. So the celebrity of Obama and his wife, Michelle, and children, Malia and Sasha, undoubtedly set a new benchmark for this negotiation of post-racial politics. And Hannah Hammad has interestingly written and recently talked about how two of the biggest stars in Hollywood during the period leading up to Obama's presidency and beyond were the celebrity identities of Will Smith, of course, of Shark Tale fame, and then Shrek's own Eddie Murphy, stars who came to reveal what Hammad terms an embodiment of post-racial discourse, and therefore a kind of commercial or box office evidence, if you like, of an increasingly post-racial America. But what I'm interested in here are sort of the terms of the post-racial in relation to a fantasy of transcendence, and maybe thinking about animation in relation to that. Colorblindness, of course, quickly became the deficiency of sight, spun out as more positive, the power for the individual not just to see color, but also the idea that racism and racial privilege no longer enjoys the social, cultural, and political power they once did in the past. So colorblindness in these terms is this seemingly common sense approach or way of looking at the world that sidelines divisions and instead supposes reality and culture as neat, clean, and crucially fixed. We have moved beyond racism. And as a culture, and though contested as we'll see, we should see skin color as insignificant and void discrimination on the grounds of color and practice a colorblind way of not seeing race as a determining factor. So despite the donkey's claims towards a more literal colorblindness, the same, I don't think, cannot be said of the stylistic repertoire of the films in which he appears. And that's particularly jarring, I think, if we look at or reflect on the persistent sort of narratives of acceptance that a lot of us have already talked about, as befits maybe a children or family film. So upon the release of the first Shrek film, Darren C. Brabham identified its troubling images of blackness, and that even though this was an animated animal without actual black skin, this doesn't hide the fact that Donkey is a black character in support of the more important narrative of white characters falling in love. And I'll return to this issue of ogreness and whiteness in a minute. But Brabham's analysis of the donkey really pivots on its recollection of cultural theorist Stuart Hall's three tropes of blackness: the native, the slave figure, and then the clown or jester. The donkey as punchline embodies essentially Hall's notion of the spectacle of the other, albeit in animated terms. And I don't think it's hard to find numerous other examples of these kinds of representational strategies across the franchise. In the alternate timeline of Shrek Forever After, the donkey's first introduced as a prisoner, whipped and beaten by a series of witches in what is clearly a master-slave relation. Later in the film, he proclaims to the gingerbread man, "What you talking about, cracker?" while also singing Whitney Houston, just as Murphy does in Coming to America, while Lionel Richie's Hello later plays when he attempts to woo or re-woo his love interest, the dragon. The rest of the series, I think, provides an opportunity to expand that sort of racialized image repertoire by considering how the franchise repeatedly draws on the four tropes of empire that have played a constitutive role within media and the way that media makes race and figures racial difference. So kind of connect that to Jess's points around kind of normalcy. So according to this typology, so I put the reference at the bottom, Shoah and Stam, we can understand the Shrek films within these discourses of empire that secured Western superiority. So in the case of animalization, colonizers confronted with the unrestrained, quote, wild beasts, body privileged over mind, with the colonized defined physically rather than intellectually. While we can think of obviously anthropomorphism as caught up in racial marking generally, the later Shrek films are increasingly hyper aware of animalized bodies. The fact that there's a lot of kind of body swapping and puss and donkey switch bodies in Shrek the Third to draw attention, I think, to this question of animal instinct. Infantilization, so obviously rationalizing the very practice of colonialism in relation to non-white identity, again, projecting the colonized as bodies rather than minds, thanks to their political, cultural, social framing as immature. Again, I don't think it's hard to find examples of Donkey as infantilized, even despite his father figure status, particularly in the case of his childlike exuberance that taps into long-standing connections that are made between blackness and animatedness. So Xian Nagai's book, Ugly Feelings, is terrific for sharpening this idea of hyperactivity and liveliness as a media marker of racial difference. And she uses Murphy's role in the animated television series, The PJs, to discuss that. Core and periphery obviously articulates difference via space, depth, and surface, with the idea of European culture as deep and profound, whereas non-European culture is shallow. Again, rationalizing the civilizing project of imperialism, or to put it another way, and I'm going to do it, Scottish ogres like onions have layers, whereas American donkeys do not. In fact, in the first Shrek, the donkey admits that he doesn't have any friends too, and that he is all alone. Unlike Shrek, however, this doesn't appear to be out of choice. And then finally, light and darkness. So this is related to sort of sight and vision via tropes of light and dark Western rationality, embodying light, of course, to establish a hierarchy against the, quote, twilight people. This also connects to intellect. And in the case of the donkey, though he can talk, because he's an anthropomorph as a sign of his exceptionalism, he nonetheless displays an inability to pronounce words. So he can't say Worcestershire in Shrek the Third, or he is unfamiliar at times with sexual reproduction, despite the fact he essentially gives rise to some hybrid dronkeys. So this issue of light and dark, I think, is also given a further edge, a racial edge in Shrek 2, through its narrative of ogre and human mixing, and the king's fear that Fiona and Shrek's children will essentially be mixed race. So rooted in this sort of pervasive, essentially Orientalist rhetoric, the generalizing project towards race within Hollywood mainstream production allows, of course, popular media to define the heroic as much as the foreign. And I also think it shows how Shrek likewise relies perhaps on a logic of racial difference that fantasies of an Obama era racial transcendence likewise sought to erase. So it's not a stretch to say then that the donkey functions as a quintessential example of what has been understood as racialized anthropomorphism, which is intended to spotlight, is a label intended to spotlight how animation transplants racial and ethnic markers or stereotypes in ways that preserve the same old pedagogies of race and gender, with the outcome being the solidification of racial undercurrents and the ideological status quo. So they argue, and this is kind of the crucial bit in the middle, characters are not simply transformed into some generic human, for there are no generic humans. Rather, they are inscribed, for example, as white humans, ogre, black humans, donkey, Asian humans, Puss in Boots, or Latino humans, Puss in Boots. Thus, we maintain that animal and other non-human characters undergo a kind of racialized anthropomorphism. So this, I think, is a useful term, holds purchase in the Shrek films, though I would say the series is, of course, not alone. If we think about the racially marked vocal performances of Will Smith in Shark Tale, Jada Pinkett Smith as a kind of mammy archetype, and Chris Rock as fool or jester in Madagascar, and then Wanda Sykes in Over the Hedge, where she plays a skunk who essentially blacks up to masquerade as a cat. Closer to Shrek's racial politics, in Shrek 2's transformation narrative, the eponymous ogre becomes a handsome white man, immediately attractive to a number of white women who immediately caress his body, and then solidified by Princess Fiona's own white human green ogre transformation that is resolved, but then continually, because of the narratives and the way that the films kind of revisit previous films or previous narratives or rework narratives, you often see her again in her sort of human form. That moment of Shrek's sort of transformation allows the film to equate ogreness not with otherness, but actually with whiteness, in ways that make the donkey's intimate stand-up performance for an army of ogres in the fourth film all the more troubling. He is the entertainment, a black clown or jester for a predominantly white audience. Shrek 2 also transformed the donkey into a white stallion, suggesting the character's only route to acceptance as a stallion baby, as he says, is to momentarily pass or masquerade as white. Despite this transformation, the donkey is still subject to sort of aggressive behavior, shouting, "Hey, why are you grabbing me? Police brutality, as he is wrestled to the floor by royal guards, who also press their knees onto his neck. The fact that the donkey as stallion's arrest is viewed in the film through a news reporter's camera as part of a parody of Cops titled Knights provides this prophetic documentary style scene with perhaps uncomfortable echoes or resonances. So I think the question becomes really what to do or to make of Shrek's racialized anthropomorphism, and why it matters to the era of colorblindness and animation's own veiling properties as a medium of expression that hides the vocal source while at the same time often accenting the character through racial markers. And I'd like to respond to this by challenging the donkey's claim that things would be so much easier if he wasn't colorblind. In fact, colorblindness is the easy option because it's rooted in the issue that to avoid the debate is to be beyond it. And as many scholars have noted, to be colorblind rather than color conscious embodies a distinct paradox. This is because to be blind is exactly that, to be oblivious or distracted from systems of privilege. So in her book, Colorblind Racism, Megan Burke notices that those who try to abstain by saying they don't see color are actually tacitly condoning the pattern of violence against minorities. What does it mean? And she's one of a number of scholars who sort of say, what does it mean not to see color when seeing color is integral to our ability to see patterns? Does not noticing race end racism? Not seeing race only leads to the blindness of habits, and if we don't see patterns, we therefore can't or won't do anything about correcting them. Colorblindness in these terms is therefore not a synonym for anti-racism, but for Burke and many others as an entrenched form of new or nice racism, and then its power comes from its metaphor of impairment. And as the introduction to the book Seeing Race again makes clear, colorblindness at the most basic level mobilizes this metaphor of visual impairment, and then the blindness part of the metaphor presumes that visually impaired people are incapable of racial recognition, and that recognition itself is the problem. So the key issue, I think, raised in this quote by way of a conclusion, and by the donkey in his failure to spot the blue flower with red thorns, is the very issue of impairment itself, that blindness implies the issue isn't racism, just our inability to see it. So within this logic of colorblindness and produced against the backdrop of an Obama-era America, it might be too far to say that the Shrek films enact a pernicious and paradoxical form of colorblind racism. But at the same time, animation as a medium is fraught all the time with issues of visibility, and rather than dilute, it holds the potential as a medium to exaggerate as part of its rhetorical operations. In the Shrek films, I suggest then that the animation and racialized anthropomorphism enacts what Robin DiAngelo terms aversive racism. And according to DiAngelo, aversively racist acts are things like avoiding direct racial language and using racially coded terms such as urban, underprivileged, diverse, and sketchy to define Black. In fact, the donkey is called as such rather than named. Throughout the Shrek films, he's referred to at various times as an ass or a little horse who smells like feet. So the donkey's blackness and persistent coding through racial markers in the series opens up, I think, a space to think about popular animation as closely mirroring the very problem of terms like post-racial and colorblindness more broadly. They all veil and deny the cultural politics of race while simultaneously sharpening and enforcing its presence. So Shrek's own racialized anthropomorphism shows how animation as a medium acts aversively, operating as an ontological deflection away from race while simultaneously shifting race onto other qualities of character, language, behavior, attitude, as part of a desire to not make it about race at all. In short, animation can maintain a harmonious image of a digital post-racial at the same time as racism is being enacted and made conscious under the surface. Or just because we can't see a blue flower with red at Thorns doesn't mean it isn't.
Thanks very much for that, Chris. That was really interesting. Thanks very much. And so we move on to the final paper of the panel, which is Julie Lobalzo Wright. Julie, would you be able to share your screen if you're ready?
Yep, just doing it. Sorry.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. And I'll quickly introduce you while you're doing that. So Julie's an assistant professor in film and television studies at the University of Warwick. She's the author of Crossover Stardom, Popular Male Music Stars in American Cinema, the co-editor of Musicals at the Margins, Genres, Boundaries, Canons, and Lasting Screen Stars, Images that Fade and Personas that Endure. And she's also published on animation in the Film Philosophy Journal and on the Fantasy Animation blog. So thanks very much, Julie. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm running into the exact same thing I think that happened to Amy, because I also am a Teams person. So I've got security and privacy coming up on sharing a screen. Sorry.
That's absolutely fine. We've got a little bit of time in hand.
So it's going into my security and I'm not quite sure what I need to press.
It's Amy. Are you on a Mac or a...
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I am too, and I think Macs make it even more challenging. It'll ask you to unlock under your security thing, and you should see a picture of like a little deadbolt, or like, you know, padlock rather, and you just click it, put in your password, and then it'll let you click Zoom, and then you should be all right.
Thank you very much, Amy. Sorry.
Thanks, Amy. We're trying not to discriminate against Teams people at this conference, but...
Many thanks. I'm glad I'm not alone.
I hate Teams with a passion, but I've been forced to use it. Is my thing showing up yet? No.
It's not yet.
This is fun. Okay. So hold on. I think I've got it. Right, it's doing the exact same thing, which is I have to leave the meeting. So I'm going to come back, okay?
Okay.
It's the exact same thing as that happened to Amy.
Okay, I'll look out for you.
These things happen. I think we've been quite fortunate today, haven't we? In terms of
Just have a couple.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What's the weather like where you are, Noel?
Grey.
Yes, same here. Yeah.
In fact, I've got the curtains mainly closed at the moment. Here's Julie back.
I love how British people in moments of uncertainty always turn to weather speak. It's one of my favorite things.
It's a social lubricant, isn't it?
It is.
So Julie's back, but I think you're on mute, so can't hear you right now.
Yeah, it says that I can't share anything. Disabled participant share.
I'm on it.
Sorry.
I think make co-host. Okay, you should be able to do it now.
Oh, wow. I think we've got it.
Excellent stuff.
Yeah, okay,
Thank you
great.
very much. Thank you for bearing with us, people.
Thank everyone for bearing with me. Okay, hi. All right, so I changed my title just a little bit, as you can see from what my proposal was. And I was going to say that I need to start by probably cursing Sam for proposing I put this paper into the conference, because I found this to end up being something that's quite tricky. So you'll see that I have a lot of thoughts in this paper, but I'm not sure if they're all kind of together quite yet. I've been thinking a lot about stars and animation and this idea of characters, where characters kind of come in. And so this is something I've kind of thought about with regard to animation, things that I've written for the Fantasy Animation blog on Rob Williams, and I've written a journal article on The Rock and Moana. So I think that there's something very difficult about thinking about stars and their relationship to characters. And then when we add animation into it, it becomes even more difficult. As you will notice from my first proposal, I began my research with the Scottish accent that Mike Myers frequently utilizes in many of his roles, and of course, in Shrek, obviously. The title of my abstract was taken from a Saturday Night Live skit that he appeared in as Stuart Rankin, the owner of the All Things Scottish gift store. He would greet customers with the tagline, "If it's not Scottish, it's clap." That's my Scottish accent for the day. Now, this character, Stuart Rankin, seemed to kind of reappear in So I Married an Axe Murderer, which was Myers' second starring film, and that was released the same year as Wayne's World 2. Stuart Mackenzie, the Scottish father of Charlie Mackenzie, also played by Myers, loves all things Scottish, with his own Scottish Wall of Fame in his home. Now, this Stuart is very similar to the store owner, Stuart Rankin, cranky, impatient, and shouty. And it's been noticed by many that Shrek possesses these same characteristics. Now, Myers began as a star on Saturday Night Live, the long-running sketch comedy show that featured a rotating, not ready for primetime cast. While Myers is not the first to leave Saturday Night Live for film stardom, he may be the first example of a Saturday Night Live cast member finding success at the cinema with an SNL character. Myers' first film, Wayne's World, co-starring SNL alum Dana Carvey, was built around the popular duo Wayne Campbell and Garth Algar, rock music fans who host a public access show from Campbell's parents' basement. As Jim Wally has noted in his book on SNL and Hollywood comedy, in the mid-1980s, there was a critical resistance to the influence of SNL on the American film industry and the numerous comedy stars that emerged from the show. Now, some of the criticism leveled against the SNL-influenced films derived from the type of performances exhibited by SNL alumni and this kind of relationship between performance, narrative, and stardom. The perception began in this period, and I'd really say probably endures to this day, as Nick Marks suggests that, quote, post-SNL careers continue to be understood as an extension of the show. I would argue that there's this kind of constellation here of various factors that impact thinking about Mike Myers as Shrek. And I should say that I'm kind of adapting Donald Crafton, who wrote in Shadow of a Mouse that there's a galaxy of relationships that encompasses the performance of animation. To be considered is Myers' grounding in television, first as a member of the Second City, then appearing on British and Canadian television for his breakout stardom on Saturday Night Live, and then his success mainly as filmic franchise characters, first as Wayne Campbell, then Austin Powers, and finally, of course, Shrek. Now, the relationship between stars and characters is really complex, sometimes even contentious. So really one of the things that's underpinning this paper is the question of who's the star? Is it Myers or Shrek? And is the overlap between character and the star actually the foundation of Myers' persona? Now, according to Richard Dyer, characters are thought to possess some of the following characteristics, as you can see I have up on the screen there. Interest, autonomy, roundness, development, interiority. But he also says that the signs of character in film include audience foreknowledge, name, appearance, gestures, actions, and of course the mise-en-scene. We see that the signs of characters in film. Now, we can see that there's some overlaps here with stardom and the star performance, permitting us to question really where the character ends and the star begins, or vice versa. David McGowan, in his book, Animated Personalities, indicates that cartoons especially, quote, try to have it both ways by using both the character and the star persona as models. I'd like to flag up if the question of, is Mike Myers the same? Really kind of trying to have it both ways. Important to kind of thinking about this is the kind of comedian comedy. And McGowan devotes an entire chapter in animated personalities to thinking about the comedian comedy and comparing animated stars to comedy performers. And this is, of course, working from the work of Steve Seidman, a type of when he talks about comedian comedies as a type of formal convention of comedic comedy in Hollywood. Philip Drake has extended Seidman's work to consider the post-classical comedian comedy, one which really arose in the 1990s, and some of Mike Myers' films fit within this category. What's really important to thinking about this context of the comedian comedy is how this comedy operates in the realm of a presentational performance. Seidman argues that this type of comedy really foregrounds performance, while Drake widens this to suggest that the comedian/star performance really becomes spectacle. Although he does note that there are dual performance frames in post-classical comedy, with the star presentational and supporting characters representational. And as Drake says, this is to sustain sufficient realism. Drake even quotes from Henry Jenkins, who maintains that comedy focuses on the gap between character and star image. But what if there's no gap to begin with? What if the actor's star is generally subsumed into character, and these characters are always changing? I'd say that Myers is a case where the characters he creates have a more significant amount of stardom than the performer himself. It can also be suggested that his inability to break through as a dramatic actor and or his failure with really his last major character of his career as Guru Pitka in the critical and box office disappointment, The Love Guru, they illustrate that the characters he has portrayed are stars more than the actor himself. If we view performances as the place where stars bring with them these associations with earlier roles and works, can we then say that we recognize Wayne Campbell in Dr. Evil or Austin Powers in Shrek? It might actually be more useful to consider the variations between performance and character in each sequel, incorporating Stuart Henderson's notion that textual and industrial levels inform the development of roles across sequels. And like genre and stardom, these character performances should conform to expectations while also distinguishing themselves from prior roles. As I pointed out in the abstract, Myers' name is not always the focus of the marketing for the Shrek films. This may be partly attributed to the paratextual relationship between animated media and the various merchandising opportunities available, especially targeted at children. Catherine Lester has argued that the Disney Princess paratext, in grouping them together, quote, allows them to communicate with and support each other in ways that their filmic narratives do not. This indicates the flexibility that is necessary for these animated characters to kind of exist both within a narrative film, one that can be attached to a star performer, but also outside of that film. And it's been noted, of course, by Sam Summers that DreamWorks utilizes casting as, quote, an act of authorial intertextuality, observing that the entirety of the animated frame can be used as a tool to direct the viewers towards the absent figure of the star. And this can be done through setting, editing, and the star's on-screen avatar. The original casting of Chris Farley, who was replaced by Myers after Farley's death, links to these arguments, both through visual and oral cues. While Farley, and it must be acknowledged, the other main cast members of Shrek, Eddie Murphy, Cameron Diaz, and John Lithgow, all perform with their natural voice, Myers' Shrek has a very noticeable accent. Myers did record the film with a Canadian drawl, but fought to re-record his part with the aforementioned Scottish accent. Now, voice really is essential to these discussions. Chris Holliday even states that the voice is typically the actor's only contribution and the sole evidence of their participation in animated films. It can be debated if Myers' performance as Shrek, especially his voice, is representational. less of a spectacle and more intrinsically tied to the narrative than, in comparison, Eddie Murphy's. However, this analysis would disregard extra textual knowledge of Mike Myers as a performer. And isn't one of the reasons you cast Myers for his performance style and the audience's awareness of this? Nick Marks has written about the reflexive flexibility in sketch comedy through jokes about their own creative process and the malleability of text. As he puts it, sketch comedy, more than any other television genre, lays bare the process of identity formation, pokes fun at its contradictions, and invites us to debate its terms. In reminding us that it's a television genre, this firmly places Myers within the intimacy of that medium. Whereas John Ellis has argued, television stars become a known and familiar person rather than a paradoxical figure, as film stars are. Furthermore, there's frequently less of a distance between television performers and their characters, leading to a slippage between TV star and character role. Whaley even opines that Myers never truly produced a defined persona, and this might be one of the reasons why he's had this limited shelf life as a performer. He's kind of retired. He retired in 2018, but he did appear in 2010 he retired, I'm sorry, and in 2018 he came back for small roles, one in Terminal and the other in Bohemian Rhapsody. Now, in some ways, I am falling into the trap that Marx highlights, viewing Myers' career as an extension of his time on Saturday Night Live. But I think a comparison with his Shrek co-star, Eddie Murphy, also an SNL alum, can really help locate what makes Myers unique. While Murphy portrayed various popular characters on SNL, Buckwheat, Mr. Robinson, James Brown, these are all much more closely aligned with Murphy's persona and his background as a stand-up comedian. Murphy had a socio-political edge to his humor that was frequently tied to issues of race and class. And as many have noted, he always delivered it with a smile and a laugh. The self is really fundamental in stand-up through self-deprecating humor, observations about daily life, use quite often of their original name. The self is also vital to the relationship between stars and audiences. As Richard Dyer has argued, we as audiences are always encouraged to locate the true self behind the public image. But while a stand-up comedian transparently presents an image of the self, even if this is a contrived and a performed image, the same cannot be said for an actor on a sketch comedy show whose appearances are repeatedly as characters with very fluctuating traits. If you know any of the Myers characters, it's hard to connect Linda Richman with Simon, the British child with his drawings, and Dieter, the disaffected West German host of Sprockets. So where does this leave Shrek, the animated character that is still miles different to other roles? Philip Drake's comment that screen performance is ontologically complex is very apt here. There are many considerations when examining the relationship between Mike Myers, star/actor, and Shrek, character/star, some that I've alluded to today and others that I just don't have the space to reference. I would argue that this one example fits within McGowan's assertions that comedian comedy and animation can productively challenge certain assumptions surrounding Hollywood stardom. No matter how we view either of them, one of Myers' greatest roles is as Shrek, and Shrek is an important and enduring cinematic character/star. Thank you for putting up with my issues with technology.
Thanks very much, Julie. And yes, it didn't end up creating any difficulties as far as time. We've still got plenty of time for questions at the end as well. So thank you very much, and virtual claps for our three speakers who raised some really interesting questions there. So we do have now some time for questions. If I could invite our three speakers to come back online. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask to kick us off? I have a number of questions myself. So if I could if I could kick off just by asking, I mean, obviously there are lots of different issues and lots of differences in the arguments you were putting forward in the 3 papers. But it struck me that there was one particular linkage, particularly with Jess and Chris's talk, regarding questions of identity and representation. And I'm just wondering, I mean, how important and how influential do you think is Shrek in the idea of representing difference, which has become such an important aspect of contemporary animation? How influential do you think the film's been in that regard?
I can go first, or I can hand over to Jess. Yeah, I would say it is influential, only in the sense that pop culture is influential. We're talking about when we think about media and the way that media makes race and makes that leap between types and stereotypes, or at least enforces that link between types and stereotypes. When Stuart Hall's writing, he's writing about the front of magazine covers. And it's important that and I don't want to get into the debate around focusing on animation, because, you know, we should be doing that anyway, but that's a separate debate. But this kind of question of popular media and popular culture mattering, and Stuart Hall says something like, if we're not thinking about popular culture, then I don't give a damn. And difference is really important to the way in which popular culture kind of creates its meaning. And so when it comes to sort of racial imaginaries, I would say that Shrek is particularly important, but no less, or in some ways no more important than we should be thinking about adverts and stuff that appears on the sides of buses, and why white celebrity chefs get to front game shows, which is one of the weirdest kind of trends with regards to opportunity and that kind of stuff. So looking at the everyday, and the way that race is made in those kinds of contexts. So obviously Shrek has I guess Shrek is a footnote to this, given that it's animation. I think that's where my interest lies, in the way that animation exists in that sense between us and the world, and the way that it can both veil and sharpen almost simultaneously. And I think that taps into Jess's points about normalcy, to Julie's points about stardom. I think there's always that really strange reciprocal relationship with the real that animation has. It can make and unmake almost in a kind of simultaneous action. So I guess, yes, really important, but no more or less important than pop culture, which is a very broad cop-out answer.
It's one of those answers that sort of encapsulates the truth of culture and society, I suppose, isn't it? You know, which you can't take Shrek out of. It's part of all of these broader discourses. Jess?
Yeah, I would just agree with that and say, like, obviously Shrek within the bigger of pop culture is important, and then also going back to Disney and how important that is in terms of what the audiences make of identity, of what they think through them films, I think is vitally important. But then also, like, in terms of my paper, certain kind of aspects of identity take that extra reading to at least think about or understand. So then there's that extra, like, pedagogical kind of aspect to it, where a lot of the audience may not even think about disability or race when they're watching a film. So then it's that extra layer of then reading into it for what they see. So, like, that is also really important.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering while you were speaking, Jess, about how it sort of like fits into the later films by Leica Studios, for instance, and Tim Burton's films, and the kind of non-conventional protagonists and anti-heroes, and Dracula in Hotel Transylvania as well. And, you know, whether we can see this as being part of a broader kind of focus on difference and sympathetic monstrosity almost within contemporary animation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, not too, like, caught up on that type. It's obviously my specialism is more like Disney, but even within that, it's that kind of line, where do you cross in terms of looking into these characters? There's so many animated characters that obviously are overtly different in some way. It's how far do you deal with that and, like, look at how they are representing what they're representing. So it's, like, super interesting. You could read into every character in so many different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And Julie, I wondered whether you had anything to add on this particular point.
I see that Sam has asked something about influence with this, and I'm sort of kind of thinking a little bit about, yeah, I think that Shrek is unique in the amount of people that, I mean, you know, it's an animated film that you can point at and say, whereas with Aladdin, it was Robin Williams, but here you've got Mike Myers, you have Eddie Murphy, you have Cameron Diaz, you have, you know, and then you add in, you know, and Antonio Banderas, and you add in more. There's quite there's quite a lot of stars within it. And I think that that's something that probably is happening more now. I think with animated films, Shark Tale is such a good example, I think, of, you know, the kind of bringing as many stars as possible in. I think what I started to go into, not a deep dive, but I started to think more and more about is Myers and him coming from that Saturday Night Live, but not being like, it's not Chevy Chase, you know, he's not someone who is kind of sort of brought himself into every single kind of impersonation or character he did on the show. He's kind of created his own character, but there's a whole history with the Wayne Campbell Wayne's World that goes all the way back to when he was on Canadian TV. So there's something interesting about his maybe desire to kind of create characters and portray those characters, and he's kind of coming up at a time when I think you started to get into, dare I say, franchise before we maybe call it franchise of what we have kind of now. But it's fascinating that he still isn't kind of, he doesn't, you know, do anything now, it seems. There's a lot of stories that he's terrible to work with, so there could be that. But so is it unique and different? Yeah, I think so. I think Shrek is an early one of let's put as many stars as we can in something. More so than even some of the examples that were mentioned within that. That was very rambling, I apologize.
Not at all, not at all. Eve, you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Hello, I just saw that my question kind of intersects with Sam's to Chris about issues of race. So Sam was asking something about if the way Shrek portrays race is representative of DreamWorks, if I understood. And my question was also about the interesting concept of racialized anthropomorphism and how, for me, maybe from a wider perspective, if it's something typical of DreamWorks, if we can see that in other, can there be anthropomorphism that is not associated with this stereotypes and so yeah, I was on top of my head, I'm always thinking about Zootopia, which is, I always struggle to wrap my head around what this film is doing, which is avoiding things that DreamWorks is doing, but at the same time can't really escape that. So I'm wondering, can we have, you know, how do you represent anthropomorphism in animation in relation to that? This turned into a massive question, but if you have any thoughts.
Yes, or I suppose it's yes, because anthropomorphism itself is a representational strategy. I think it is, and this goes back to, I think, the point around tropes of empire and animalization. I think there is something fundamentally racial about the way in which anthropomorphism works as a strategy of representation. I think there are, and hopefully as animation studies or film and media studies maybe moves towards questions of sort of production studies and thinks about, you know, Chris Pallett's work on storyboarding and kind of going back through and even Marit's work on kind of costume design and thinking about some of the design choices within individual studios and then across individual studios, which is sort of, you know, this is both a conference about Shrek, but also about kind of pop culture and Shrek's place in relation to Disney and in relation to Pixar and all that kind of stuff. So I think anthropomorphism is itself a sort of, yeah, comes with, I think race comes with the territory with regards to, and as Jess says, I think ableism is also part of that. There are decisions that are made around animals as symbols, animals as ciphers, animals as particular kinds of bodies. And I don't think race and gender can be dislocated from that. You only have to look at Space Jam. Well, you don't even have to look at Space Jam. You can look at the Nick Salmon's writing on Mickey Mouse and Minstrelsy, and there's so mmany different ways in which animation and race sort of come together. On the question of the specificity of DreamWorks, all I can think about is Brad Pitt and Megamind. That's all I can think about. And whether or not there are some interesting things, as we know from Richard R, heterosexual masculinity, heterosexual white masculinity is like air. You breathe it in all the time, and you're not conscious of it. I think animation makes it conscious, and it can make it conscious through anthropomorphism, but it can also make it conscious through ability or disability, ableist discourses, star voices. I don't think DreamWorks has a monopoly on it, even though my examples were from some dubious choices in representation in DreamWorks. But yeah, I don't have more. I mean, people probably know DreamWorks films better than I do, but yeah, Megamind would be a good one for kind of whiteness and Brad Pitt, and I think maybe kind of tying in race and stardom.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
The Bee Movie. Sorry, the Bee Movie.
No, sorry.
I was just going to say the Bee Movie is another one that I always think of. That Jerry Seinfeld is the bee.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think there is a thing with going to your point on comedian comedy. The first wave of, well, not first wave, but there are some trends even within star voices, and I think stand-up comedians and improvisation is very much part of that. There are different registers. Yeah, the whiteness of Seinfeld. I know Sam loves a bit of B movies, so yeah.
Yeah, anyone who just wants to jump in and shout out B movie like Julie did is welcome to do so at any point in the day.
All interjections welcome, particularly related to B movie. Ruth, just building on some of the things we've just been talking about, Ruth has a point here. I'm from Mexico, and here only the Spanish dubbed version was consumed. I mention this because from the papers presented in this panel, I've realized there are interpretations associated with representation and identities that are not viable from the dubbed version. I'm thinking especially of the racialized analysis of Donkey, which is more viable in the original version, especially because of Eddie Murphy's voice, than the Spanish version, in which the actor Eugenio Derbez participated. My question in this sense for Chris has to do with how you observe this phenomenon of the loss of identity values such as race, which are no longer strong in dubbing.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point. Really, really good point. I guess I was thinking, I suppose if we think about race in the same way as we think about gender in relation to sort of cultural performativity, race is something that is performed, and one of the ways it is performed is through voice, but crucially not the only way. So these sorts of local dubbing practices, I think, are super interesting because they obviously manipulate how we understand stars. In the case of the Shrek films, if you take out Joan Rivers' voice from the character that looks like Joan Rivers and put Kate Thornton's voice in there, you're going to have a mismatch, which again yields to some really, the way that animation is accented in different parts of the world, and redubbed or reanimated in some cases. In the question of race, I think the racialized analysis, I wouldn't say it's not viable because of the change in the voice. I would say that it allows us to think about the aversively racist tactics of animation that don't rely on the voice. The UK popular press is when I've taught the Postracial, I put up a headline, all the headlines of the way in which the Sun has described Meghan Markle without using the word black. And there are connections to guns, violence, drugs. There's one references to serial killers. So there's just different ways of doing it. So I think in a case of Shrek, in the case of the donkey, the voice is obviously a really important part of its racial project, but the removal of it, I think, perhaps doesn't destabilize the way in which donkey is still performing as black. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess one of the things about the whole process of dubbing is that it occludes certain things that are present within the original in a way that the visual image doesn't. The visual image tends not to change, internationally. But this has important ramifications because each time it's sort of dubbed in different languages, the film is subtly changed in ways that might appear to be invisible, but which often have important resonances. Obviously, we're sort of getting into slightly different territory here, but there's obviously lots of interesting work on translation that looks at translations being a creative act and how that fits into how films are reinterpreted on an international level. Just looking at a point that Jennifer makes, kind of like neatly fits into this. Maya's choice to switch to a soft Scottish brogue has a national and class ramifications, for example. I mean, obviously this fits into what Julie was talking about here. And also Julie's pointing out there are also stars who only dub certain roles and those stars. There is someone who only dubs Tom Cruise, which is interesting as well. It's sort of interesting, this whole thing, isn't it, of Maya's, because he didn't originally do a Scottish voice, did he? He sort of, he tried it and people found it to be much funnier for some particular reason. How do you think that plays into some of the ideas we've been talking about, Julie?
Yeah, I think that the idea of class and accent's really interesting because, I mean, there's a couple ways I would come at it. The first is, as an American who's married to a Scot, Americans don't quite associate class with the accents in the way that you do in Britain. So for example, I can't tell you how many times you watch something with Michael Caine and people in America are like, oh, he's British, not he's working class, Cockney, London, da, 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 da. So there's some specificity there that I think can be kind of lost. I do think there's something interesting about the Scottish accent, which I know people have said sometimes is, someone was saying to me just the other day that call centers like to have Scottish voices because there's something very homely and something very, I don't know, kind of nice about the kind of Scottish brogue. So in some ways, I think it's working with that idea of it being kind of homely, but also threatening, because it can be threatening too. With Myers, I think there's a sense that if you see the Farley stuff, there's something quite kind of sad about Shrek. And I feel like with Myers and his voice, he's kind of able to bring out maybe more of the humor, or that we can still have an element of feeling sorry for him, but not a tragedy around it that I think the Farley voice maybe had a little bit more of. There's something about Myers I find interesting in that he feels that he clearly as an actor feels that he needs to embellish things or he needs to add things. Even if you watch him in dramatic films, he puts on certain voices or there's something about obviously his kind of process and idea of how to act is around altering his voice, he doesn't alter his body too much, but he'll kind of use prosthetics in slight ways with, Dr. Evil or Austin Powers. But it's a lot about kind of facial gestures. It's a lot about voice. It's a lot about tone. And then accents, I think, comes into it too. That's, again, quite rambling, but there's a lot of different ideas, I think, there to engage with.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I mean, you could compare and contrast maybe the use of the way Mike Myers disguises his voice to how John Goodman is presented in Monsters, Inc., for instance, where the voice is kind of like recognizable instantly and you can tend to associate it with the other roles that Goodman's played maybe. Yeah,
I mean, that's a good one. Monsters, Inc., I think both of those voices, we kind of know who they are. I feel like that's slightly what Eddie Murphy's doing a little bit. It's Eddie Murphy, but it's kind of Eddie Murphy, a little more, I guess, maybe presentational. I mean, there's just that little bit more accent on what his voice does and what his voice can do, which is very different to Myers, who seems to need to put a different voice on.
If I might interject, it does seem to be that when these people perform presentationally, these comedians, what they bring with them is their particular skill. And there's so much talk about what Robin Williams does in Aladdin, that he's bringing his skills of improvisation, impressions to that role. And there's an extent of that in what Murphy is known for and what Murphy is doing as the donkey. But it seems to be that Mike Myers' skill, like what a Mike Myers presentational performance is him giving a representational performance, is him performing in character. I mean, I don't know if anyone saw, they brought back the Gong Show in America a couple of years ago, and there was this host, and it was like this kind of overweight older British guy, and no one knew who this guy was, and they gave him like a backstory and stuff. And then after the show came out, it turned out it was Mike Myers in a costume. And it's like, so we're getting this very famous person to host this show, but we're not foregrounding his participation because he's bringing what he brings to a role, to that role, which is his ability to inhabit these characters. So it bridges that gap between presentation and representation, I think. And actually, while I've got my mic on, no, sorry, can I just pose a question to Jess while I'm already here? Yeah, I did just want to bring back the question that I popped in the chat earlier, which is, where do you think Shrek fits in with the rest of DreamWorks' catalogue in terms of how it represents disability and difference? And I'm thinking of things like Megamind and like Monsters versus Aliens. And if your focus is generally on Disney, as you say, how does the DreamWorks as a whole approach to representing difference, if you think that they do have a cohesive approach, how does that compare to Disney's overall approach?
Yeah, thank you. Well, from my paper and from what I've done on Shrek, I think it has that kind of good representation in terms of that affirmative, like positive identity. It is more about like identity than obviously like a physical impairment, but it's read through that way. But it takes that kind of critical reading to understand that. I'm not too familiar with too much more of DreamWorks, but I know How to Train Your Dragon, that has quite a few characters that do have physical impairments. And from what I've read on that, that is done in a good and like authentic way, which I think is good in terms of comparing with Disney. A lot of Disney is, well, even not that good because they include physical impairment, but the way that it's always used for a different reason rather than it just existing as their impairment. Or then the more recent films, for example, I'm working on Frozen and Wreck-It Ralph in terms of their ability, but it's encoded as a magical power. But the way it can be read is that they use it for their empowerment and they use it and like, keep it. They don't have to overcome it. So I would like to touch on the comparison in terms of Disney as a whole and DreamWorks as a whole, just to see that difference. But obviously, dealing with Disney as a whole is already quite a lot to do. But yeah, it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think we get a sense as well as the inherent ambivalence of these films as well, because we've spoken about the way in which these films can actually reinscribe kind of racial prejudices, but there's also the sense as well in which the films might actually make a sort of productive engagement with issues of representations of disability. So, without being too reductive, the films are actually kind of inherently ambivalent, and they can work both ways in the kind of political sense, maybe. I mean, that's a much broader issue and question, I think, isn't it? And we're running out of time now. But does anyone have any final questions or comments just before we wrap up? Because we are on 3:45 now. I just wanted to finish. Jordan's made a comment, just echoing really what Jess was saying about How to Train Your Dragon as being a very strong example of disability being positively represented. Hiccup's the first major hero who's hurt in action and then who lives with the disability and leaves him dealing with it. Really opened my eyes to the power of positive representation in animation, first major one I saw in childhood. So yes, very interesting questions here. We've obviously only scratched the surface, but it is time to wrap up this panel now. And I just really like to thank our three panelists, Jess, Chris, and Julie, for their great papers and for everyone for their really interesting insights and comments as well. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, cheers, guys. Thank you. Yeah, excellent. Another great panel. I love it. I love the questions, all fabulous. Yeah, since it's my conference, though, I had one more thing that I wanted to add before I cut to break, just because we were talking about Dragon, and it just made me think about there's been a lot of talk recently about the representation of disability and difference in the Bond movies with No Time to Die, and how so many of those villains are disabled or otherwise disfigured. And often in the Bond films, that comes with a replacement, like Jaws has his metal teeth, and there's the guy for Teehee from Live and Let Die who has like a robot arm, and the guy in the new one has like a robot eye. And it's like often disability is and difference is replaced with something useful and something powerful, and that seems to be how it is a lot of the cases with regards to Disney, is in terms of Elsa and characters like that. And yeah, just How to Train Your Dragon, it's one where the character has to live with his disability, and as well, both Hiccup and Toothless, and that carries through all of those movies. And it's something that isn't necessarily an augmentation, but it isn't necessarily a detraction either. And it is something that he lives with without it being like commodified in the same way that it is with the Bond villains or Elsa. Or I was thinking about this because I was watching Gerald McBoing Boing the other day in class, and then that idea came up there as well, if anyone's seen that short. Anyway, that's just my excuse to ramble. Okay, let's cut to break. We will return at 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time for our final panel. Thank you, guys. You've all been all stars today for sticking with it.